Each week, American History TV sits in on a college lecture by history professors from across the country. You can join the lectures Saturdays at 8 p.m. and midnight, and Sundays at 11 a.m. Professor Christina Snyder of Indiana University is a specialist in Native American history. In today's class, she talks about the first encounters between Africans, Native Americans, and Europeans. The class is 2 hours.
Okay, everybody, so let's go ahead and get started today. We're back for another exciting installment of J300. And so what we're talking about today is first encounters. And we read 3 different pieces that we'll talk about in discussion in a minute. And when we think about these documents, the specific skill that we're going to be talking about is the importance of perspective. So we're still kind of going through the portion of the class where we're thinking about how to approach primary sources. You know, what do we do with primary sources? And so today I want us to think a lot about who wrote these sources and what their motivation was for writing them and what their biases might have been. So what we're going to do to start off class today is some of our classmates are going to do a reading that was not assigned to everybody. And this activity is designed to capture some of the experience of first encounters, some of the emotions and ideas that people might have felt when encountering others for the first time, people that were very different from themselves. So this is a speech that you might have heard if you're a Native person, let's say living in Arkansas, what's now Arkansas, in the 1540s, when Hernando de Soto came through. He and his army of 600 Spaniards might have approached your town and made a speech that went something like this. So we're going to start off with John. Take it away, John.
De parte del rey Don Fernando y de su hija Doña Juana, reina de Castilla y León, domadores de pueblos bárbaros, nosotros, sus siervos, os notificamos, osamos hasta saber cómo mejor podemos. Que Dios nuestro Señor, uno y eterno, creó el cielo y la tierra, y un hombre y una mujer, de quien nos y vosotros y todos los hombres del mundo fueron y son descendientes y procreados. De todos los que después de nosotros vinieran, más por la muchedumbre de la generación que de estos ha salido desde hace 5,000 y hace más años que el mundo fue creado. Fue necesario que los unos hombres fuesen por una parte y otros por otro, y se dividiesen por muchos reinos y provincias que en una sola no se podían sostener y conservar.
Go ahead, Maggie.
Así que ses majestades son reyes y señores de estas islas, y tierra firme per virtud de la dicha de nación. Y como a tales, reyes y señores, algunas islas más, y casa todas, a quien esto ha sido notificado, han recibido a sus majestades, y los han obedecido y servido, y sirven como súbditos lo deben hacer. Y con buena voluntad y sin ninguna resistencia, y luego sin dilación, como fueron informados de los súbditos, obedecieron y recibieron los veranos religiosos con sus altezas, les enviaban para que los predicasen y enseñase nuestra Santa Fe y todos ellos de su libre, agradable voluntad, sin premio ni condición alguna, se tornaron cristianos y lo son, y sus majestades lo recibieron alegre y benignamente, y así los mandaron tratar como a los otros súbditos y vasallos, y vosotros sois tenidos y obligados a hacer lo mismo.
And if you do so this, you will do well, and do what you are beholden to do and are obliged to do. And their highnesses, and we, acting in their names, will receive you with all love and charity. And we shall leave your wives, and your children, and your homes to be free and unenslaved. For if you do so freely for you to do with freely as you wish and deem right. And they will not compel you to become Christian, but only if you yourselves, being informed of the truth, would like to be converted to our holy Catholic faith, as almost all your neighbors on the other islands have done, in which case their highnesses will extend unto you many privileges, allow you exemptions, and give you many thanks.
And if you do not do this, or maliciously delay in doing it, we assure you that with God's help we will come upon you and make war upon you everywhere and in every way we can, and will subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and their majesties, and will take from you and your bodies, your wives, your children, and make them slaves, as the slaves shall sell and depose of them, however their majesties may command. And we shall take your goods and do unto you all harm and evil we can, as unto the vassals who do not obey and deny their lords, and resist and contradict them. And we declare that the deaths and damages that result from your denial are your fault and not the majesty's fault, or our fault, or the fault of any gentleman who attend us. And just as we have said and required, we ask that the scribe here present write it down and sign it in testimony that all here present act as witness.
All right, thanks, guys. Excellent job. So what we just heard is selections from the Requiri Miento, which is a speech that was crafted by the Spanish crown and given many, many times over throughout the Americas to indigenous audiences by conquistadors. So the reason that I had John and Maggie start reading it in Spanish is because that's how it would have originally been read to Indian audiences. So in Spanish, in a language they did not understand. Now, eventually, interpreters were required if they were available after a few decades. But just listening to this, it helps capture, some of the experience, because I'm sure most of you guys, how many people speak Spanish fluently? I mean, how many people understood what John and Maggie said? Okay, nobody. Okay, so that helps us to understand what it might have been like to hear the speech in a foreign language. And then part of Adam and Morgan gave us the experience of if you did have an interpreter, this is what the speech might have sounded like. If you had a really, really good interpreter, right? Because these are not easy words to translate. But what's your first reaction to hearing this?
Overwhelming.
Overwhelming. Okay.
Some big words.
Lots of big words. Anybody else? Morgan?
I feel like also, especially in the Spanish, if it's in a different language, it's like interesting for about like 10 seconds.
Right.
And then you don't know what they're saying, so you just kind of like drown it out.
Right. And imagine how this might have looked. You guys who did the readings did some different interpretations of it, right? Adam was kind of more dramatic. John just kind of went through it quickly. But it would have varied too, depending on who gave the speech. And if you can imagine their Indian audiences, they might have gathered in front of a town and been interested, like Morgan said, for maybe the first 5 minutes, and then been like, what the heck is going on? What are these guys saying? I have no idea what's going on. Anybody else? What were some of your first reactions to this? Grace?
Well, to the translation, it's actually pretty upsetting because I hope I didn't hear it wrong, but it sounded like he was, saying we'll only convert you like if you want to, but if you don't,
right,
we're gonna start a war with you. And it's like even if you, it's like you don't know what's going on when it's read in Spanish, but it's really not good once you figure out what he is actually saying.
Right, right. Maybe when it's all in a different language, it's a bit of a mystery, but you may have been able to guess. Partially, imagine just the visuals on this, right? That there's an army of, these are generally pretty large armies, and DeSoto, for example, is 600 men, all heavily armed, and again, almost all men. So all this might have signaled to the audience danger, right? That it's going to be, probably just even the image of it seemed dangerous, right? And then the implications, once you actually understand what it's all about, is even more pernicious, right? So what does it basically say? John and Maggie, if you guys can, since other people aren't fluent in Spanish, can you tell us what your portion said, just basically in a sentence or two? John, what about you? Can you just tell us?
Yeah, pretty much starts off, "Your King Ferdinand," that he's the king of you guys, everybody, and
King Ferdinand is the king, right? He owns these islands, by which he means the Caribbean
that
and the Americas.
you pretty much can't do it on your own, so you need us to help you. Pretty much what it says.
Okay. So the first paragraph kind of introduces the audience to the Spanish crown, Spanish authority, and saying, you should submit to us. Maggie, what about your paragraph?
Basically, mine says that you need to oblige by these rules, and it'll be for your betterment. It'll be for your well-being, and you'll receive all this happiness and stuff if you happen to become a Christian. And
Right.
all this stuff.
So they're offering Christianity, right? They're saying, King Ferdinand owns these islands. You should submit. If you do, you'll be happy. And if you don't, Morgan, what happens?
We're going to make you slaves and take your children and your wives and
Do all the violence that we can to you. Right? It's very evocative. Anybody else have any reactions? Anything you want to mention? Stephen, what do you think?
How much contact with the Spanish that they had before they would have read this?
Pretty minimal for most people. These are some of the very first encounters that Native people had directly with Europeans. So for many of them, it's the very first time that they're meeting Europeans. What kind of impression do you think that left?
Well, I was just going to say, many of us, we don't, we're not fluent in Spanish, so we didn't really know what they were saying. But if they would have just said it with, just a slightly happier tone, or, more just nice, things could have been totally different. You just could have, it would be easy to convince people that you're just here to be nice and that, come do this, we're just trying to be good people and we're friendly and not, we're going to take your wives and children and stuff.
Right.
Because if we don't understand it, and if, say the other people didn't understand Spanish.
Absolutely. So, a lot of this is also depending on tone. You could be deceptive, right? Maggie?
I think it's kind of arrogant that they would come into someone else's nation with this long speech and declaration, especially knowing that they probably don't know the language. It kind of shows that they don't come for friendliness, they come for intimidation. So if they were there for friendliness, they would have understood that, there's no communication verbally without, sign language and gifts to be given and things like that.
Right, right. It definitely conveys, I think, there are ways in which Ashley is right, that it could have been read in a deceptive way. It could have been just read in a really boring way. Imagine how many times would you read this speech? If you're trekking through the entire Southeast, if we're thinking again about De Soto's army, they literally went through hundreds of villages. So the people who are giving the speech are doing it over and over and over again. So they're probably really bored. But overall, the tone is really threatening, right? And, as Maggie said, very arrogant. So let's think about, again, so the major topic that we're talking about in terms of developing our skills as historians is perspective. So let's think about the perspective of Native people versus the perspective of the Spanish themselves. So, Maggie said Native people might have thought of this as arrogant. So imagine, again, we're doing this exercise where you're thinking about yourself being in the audience hearing this speech. What other reactions do you think that Indians might have had? Sarah?
They're probably just scared. These people are coming in, they're not giving gifts, which we've discussed as being
more of a customary approach to introducing people to each other. They're like just coming in and giving speeches. They're not even like coming in and being violent. So they're probably just taken aback.
Okay, so as Sarah said, when Native people encountered outsiders, and especially if they're trying to build relationships with outsiders, they often exchange goods, right? That goods were a sign not just of a desire to trade, but of a social relationship. It's a sign of good intentions, right? But the Spanish aren't coming and giving gifts. They're making demands, right? Anybody else? How might Native people have experienced this? Stephen?
Well, like in some of the readings, they probably were thinking about how new the Spanish were, like their new clothes and symbols and everything, rather than the actual words.
Absolutely. So, you know, Native people are hearing these words, but they're also trying to read people's bodies to understand what's going on. I mean, we do this all the time as human beings. We read facial expressions and clothes and even gender to try to decide how we might react to somebody. And so let's think about, again, the visuals. What kind of things do you think they might have seen, Stephen? Picked out in particular.
Clothes.
Okay.
Weapons if they had any.
And do you think they had weapons? They're conquistadors. Yep. De Soto's army, literally, when they came to the southeast, they were trekking around in full body armor, even during the summer. So these are pretty medieval guys, actually. They've got on chainmail and lances, and they actually even have a primitive kind of firearm called an arquebus that makes a really loud noise. So there would have been a lot of novelty to these people. They looked different. They're wearing this armor. They've got these new weapons. What else might have Native people seen? Just visually, think about the image. What else do you think the Spaniards had with them? Horses, right? Morgan, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, I just knew the answer is horses.
Okay. The answer is horses, yes. So they're seeing horses for the first time, right? We talked about how there were horses, giant horses, in native North America in the last ice age, but that was 10,000 years ago, and they had become extinct. So Native people had not had any experience with horses, and these were entirely new beings in their world. So they gave, and when people encounter new things, they come up with new names, right? So they called horses elk dogs and giant dogs, because that was kind of analogous. But even the Spaniards' horses actually had on chainmail, too. And they often had on these masks that kind of covered their muzzles. So even the horses themselves look like they've got weapons, you know? Anything else visually about the Spaniards that might have been remarkable, interesting? One more thing that the Spaniards had with them, which the Native people were had some experience with, were dogs. And Native people's dogs, you know, they're traditionally for hunting and also for, you know, safeguarding villages and things like that, the kinds of things we use dogs for now. But the Spaniards also had dogs of war. They had giant mastiffs that they came to the New World with. And these mastiffs were actually called Canary Island mastiffs, not because they came from the Canary Islands, but because they were used to exterminate the Canary Islanders before the Spaniards came to the Americas. So, and these dogs were trained to kill people. The Canary Island Mastiff, by the way, is illegal in many states in the US now. And obviously dogs have to be trained to be mean, but these were dogs who were trained to kill. And they often wore chainmail as well. And we know from the De Soto expedition, for example, that Native people were actually more afraid of these dogs than of the horses, because they were killers. We'll come back to the visuals later when we talk about the documents. Is there anything else you guys want to mention about Native people reacting, maybe? John?
I know they made a video about the ships they came in.
Yeah, so even the way, now if Native people are encountering Europeans in a coastal kind of environment, they would have seen these ships. And that was something that was really remarkable to them. Now, a lot of Native people had watercrafts, but nothing this big, which, you know, some of these ships look like floating islands, is what people compared them to. Anything else about how people might have reacted? Okay, what do you think the Spaniards thought about the Requerimiento? I mean, why read it? Why would you make up this talk in the first place? Why give it? How do you think people might have felt about it when they were giving the speech? Grace.
Perhaps a lot of them felt like it was their duty as Christians to do this, to spread Christianity. And I imagine many of them probably wouldn't have really questioned it.
Okay. These are soldiers, after all, right? They've been given orders. And the Spanish, part of the Spanish mission of colonization is to convert Native people. Remember that the Spanish are kind of fresh off of the reconquest of Spain from the Moors. And they have this idea of themselves as holy conquerors. And at this point, they're also seeking to spread Christianity throughout the Americas. So that's one of their major missions of colonization. So Maggie, what about you? What do you think?
I feel like after a certain period of time, they would have been so bored, like trekking through this land that they're not familiar with in full armor, and it's hot outside. And they've probably said this to, you know, every single Native person that they run into. I mean, I could totally see some of the soldiers like rolling their eyes and just being like, okay, at this point in time, are we going to do anything about it, or are we just going to continue to read this to people who don't understand it?
Okay, right. So, I mean, Spaniards could have been bored with it. They could have, especially, you know, Maggie's right in that some of these treks lasted, the DeSoto expedition, for example, lasted 4 years. And initially, this was an expedition that went through the heart of North America, trying to find a kingdom that was rich in silver and gold, just like the Aztec empire of Mesoamerica. They never did find silver and gold. People were dying all the time. They were dying of malnutrition, of disease. They're tired. They're attacked quite frequently. They're probably, I mean, how effective do you think this is? How many Native people do you think hear the speech and say, sign me up, I want to be on your team, this is great, please convert me? Do you think it's okay, probably very few, right? Because first of all, there's an issue of understanding it in the first place, and if it's in a different language, there's really no way you're going to understand it. Yeah, Morgan.
You said earlier that there would be interpreters if interpreters were available. Mm-hmm. Was that maybe like a third or fourth series of expeditions kind of thing? Because I feel like when you first get there's not going to be enough people who come in contact with both groups of people.
That's right. So Morgan asked about the issue of having interpreters. And you're absolutely right then that the first expeditions, you really have, nobody's able to translate, right? That takes, at least, how long would it take to become fluent in a foreign language? That would take at least, 6 months of exposure to another people, and usually it needs to be much longer than that for somebody to translate something as complicated as this. So you're right in that this is really something of a second and third generation kind of experience, being able to understand it in your own language. And the other thing is if available. I mean, even if there are, and this isn't, even if there is an interpreter, whether that person is an Indian or a European, they may not be in the village, they may not be available. And we're also talking about the linguistic diversity of the Americas is incredible, right? We talked about in 1492, there are over 500 different languages north of Mexico alone. So even if you have a Spaniard who knows a native language or two, there's no guarantee that that language will be the same in Arkansas as it is, let's say, in Mississippi, in what's now Mississippi. So even if places are close together, their languages can be really, really different. John?
I think it was more like a guilt thing for the Spanish crown.
Okay.
They say, they say we told you what was gonna happen if you didn't listen to us. Like, it's like having someone who can't read sign a contract. Like, you don't
Yeah.
know. Like.
And I think this comparison, so John said, he compared it to a contract, and I think that's an excellent comparison, right? That's kind of what it's like. We're offering you this choice. If you reject it, here are the consequences. And so, in a way, it's this kind of legal document that's covering the Spanish, it's making some kind of feeble attempts to make them feel better about what's happening also. So your book mentioned, one of the discussion questions in your book was, there was a missionary named Bartolomé de las Casas, who was one of the early critics of Spanish colonialism in the Caribbean. And he's actually one of the reasons why the requerimiento was created in the first place, because he said that the Spaniards are mistreating native peoples in the Americas, and we need reform. And he wasn't the only one. I mean, Spaniards, part of why I bring this out is that, native people probably didn't have a monolithic opinion about the requerimiento, right? They probably had different ideas about the requerimiento, depending on how they experienced it, depending on how much of it they actually understood. But Spaniards probably had different opinions about it too. I mean, we know that they did. And so Las Casas, for example, the first time he heard the requerimiento, he said he didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. What do you guys think he meant about that? Didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. Adam?
Well, the text is just so absolutely ridiculous in how contradictory it is. And so it's funny in that aspect, but the idea that this is going to be responsible for Spanish colonialism for the next 100, 200 years is a pretty depressing thought.
Okay. So it's a pretty depressing thought. And again, some of you guys brought up the fact, as Stephen said, so is this the first time that they've met Europeans? For most people, yes. And the precedent it sets is, it doesn't bode well, does it? Okay. Anything else about the requerimiento before we move on? I do actually want to show you guys one more primary document, and this comes from the Coronado expedition. Francisco Coronado came through the Southwest, and many of these people, the first Europeans to come into early America, were on a treasure hunt, right? They're looking for gold and silver. And so when Coronado comes through, he goes through a village in New Mexico in 1540 and gives the speech. And one of the members of the expedition wrote an account of it, and this is what he said. People from the whole region had gathered there. These people were drawn up waiting in orderly squadrons on a field inside of the town. When the interpreters proclaimed the requerimiento to them, and they did not reply with offers of peace, but showed themselves more bold, our men shouted, "Santiago, Santiago," charged and dispersed them. So obviously this is presaging violence, right? And what are the Spaniards doing when they're shouting, "Santiago, Santiago"? What happens? So Santiago is St. James, who's the patron saint of Spain. And when Native people don't immediately respond favorably, the Spaniards charge the crowd, right? So predictably, this doesn't turn out well. Okay, so for today, we're talking about early encounters, first encounters between Europeans, Indians, and Africans in North America. And we're looking at 3 different documents. And first of all, we're going to take a look at the map, as we do in every class, and just kind of see where these people are coming from, where these encounters are happening. Because I know this is it's a lot of different Native groups and a lot of different places. So we're going to try to keep track of them at least somewhat. So the first document that you read came from an oral tradition by the Montani Indians. And the Montanis live up here, north of the St. Lawrence River, now in what is the eastern part of Canada. Okay? And the Montani are encountering the French. The story itself is probably about French fishermen who come to the Montani region in the early 1500s. The second document that you read was John Smith meeting the Powhatans. So we've talked about this a little bit, and we see that the Powhatans lived in the Chesapeake region of what's now Virginia. And Smith and his people are from England, right? The third document that we read was by Alauda Equiano, and Equiano is from Africa. He's from what's probably the area that's now Nigeria. And he goes, he's initially sold to Virginia. So again, it's in this tidewater region of the middle colonies. So they're also from kind of different time periods, right? So we're seeing a little bit of diversity over time, but I think that, as we'll note in our discussion, there are a lot of commonalities between these documents, and there are certain observations that we can make about early encounters in general. So let's, I'm going to start just by giving you guys a brief introduction that's a little bit more complete than what we had in the reader. So this first document, again, comes from the Montani encountering the French for the first time. And it's recorded by a missionary named Paul Lejeune in 1633. But it records events that happened much earlier, so probably around 1500. And it's told to Lejeune by a Montani man whose grandmother had told it to him. So what it effectively is an oral tradition, right? That's probably been, the grandmother herself was probably, may have been around when the French first came, or she heard about it. But in any event, this is an oral tradition that's written down pretty quickly in the colonial period. But it's changing forms here. And the man who records it is actually French. So that makes a difference too, because he's putting his own observations in there as well, right? So moving on to the Smith document. This, I mentioned to you guys that he has 3 autobiographies. This is the one that's published in 1624, although the events that are covered in it, the first events happened in 1607. And then the latter events record when John Smith met Pocahontas when she came to England. So this is the first time that he's seen Pocahontas since she was a little girl. So it covers quite a time span. And Smith's autobiography, he fancied himself an adventurer, right? So this is an adventurer's tale. And it recounts his whole life, much of which was spent being a mercenary. He's captured while fighting Turkish forces and becomes a slave in Istanbul and escapes. Once he comes to Virginia, he's already an experienced soldier. He has great leadership and organizational skills, and he becomes president of Jamestown, so effectively leads Jamestown in 1608, but leaves the following year after he's wounded. So he's really not in Jamestown for very long, only 2 years. We have part of here in the document that we read about Smith and Pocahontas, this love story that we're all so familiar with, that we watched part of when we watched a clip from The New World on the first day of class, and that you guys have also seen in the Disney movie of your generation, Pocahontas, right, as interpreted by Disney. And so we read part of where that tradition comes from. And when we think about Smith, I want to draw to your attention that the love story that we see in there is a trope. And what a trope means is a kind of a reoccurring theme that has a kind of a standardized form. Okay, and this is something that the trope itself and on which Smith draws is that he is he's in a foreign land, he's in an exotic place, he's captured by some kind of a foreign king and thrown into a captivity type situation. He's about to die, but at the last minute is rescued by a princess who falls in love with him. And this is something, so this kind of follows the Pocahontas story. You guys can see how it's really similar. But the trope, this comes out as early as 1300 in Scottish ballads. So this is a kind of literary form that's really well known to Smith's audience. And he's kind of making his story conform to that trope. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a minute. So our last document is by Alada Equiano, who lived in the mid-18th century, so he's a little bit later. And this comes from his autobiography, which was published in 1789. And the autobiography obviously gives information about Equiano's life, but part of its mission is the abolition of slavery and making an argument for the human rights of African people. So he's born in what's now Nigeria. Some scholars argue otherwise, and we'll talk about that. But initially, he's captured when he's about 11 or 12 years old and sold to European slave traders. He's initially sold to Virginia, but he doesn't live there very long. He's pretty quickly resold, as many slaves were, to the Caribbean, and specifically to Montserrat, where he becomes the slave of a Quaker merchant who allows Equiano to work toward his freedom. And Equiano actually achieves that by his early 20s. So he's made enough money in his spare time through his own efforts to buy his freedom. After that, he moves to London and becomes an abolitionist. And I should mention, too, that during his period of slavery, he was educated. He learned how to read and write, in part with the help and permission of his Quaker master. So he's well educated. Okay. So now let's talk about these documents together. And for this, let's pull out our worksheets that you guys did for class today. And I know some of you weren't able to print them out, but just kind of recall from memory. So let's talk about the first question here. We have Amontillado Indians encountering the French, an African boy encountering European slave traders, and John Smith meeting the Powhatans for the first time. And what does each think of the other? What did they decide to record as remarkable? What are some of the things that come up? Adam.
The Montagnais keep talking about the French and their eating habits.
Yeah.
So they talk about them eating hardtack and drinking wine, but they call it drinking blood.
Yeah.
And they call them people who work with wood in reference to their ships. And
right.
They're very interested in their clothing as well.
Okay.
And those are the sort of things that stand out in the story.
Okay.
Their little behaviors.
Okay. Let's keep kind of a running list, because Adam mentioned several important things. So the first is food. And so the issue of food is pretty interesting, and what Adam, how he described this was a little thing, right? The food is kind of the stuff of everyday life. But why would it be interesting or remarkable? Food's often something that people remark on when they're meeting others for the first time. Or even think about today, maybe in your own experience, going to a foreign country, the food, I think, is something that a lot of us kind of pick up on. And why is that? Why is food interesting or revealing, do you think? Grace?
I think the Native Americans couldn't really understand why they would be eating this hardtack. They thought it was kind of horrible, and I think
right.
that, like, you know, even today, some people have that idea of, like, foreign food. Some people can't understand why people in another country would eat what they eat. It's just something interesting that people kind of pay attention to.
So it's, first of all, it's an issue of taste, you know, and everybody has to eat, right? So we're all we're interested in food because we all eat every day, all the time, but we have pretty particular ideas about what's good, right, and what's not good. And hardtack, by pretty much anybody's account, is not good, right? Does anybody know? Can somebody tell us what it is, maybe for people who don't know? Hardtack, Adam?
It's like a very thick biscuit,
Uh-huh.
almost, and it's very rough and hard and brittle and breaks apart really easily.
Okay, so it's this really disgusting baked good that Europeans packed on long voyages, and it is a kind of hard biscuit, and it's stale, right? It's been traveling for months usually. Even sailors themselves talk about how disgusting it is, and it was often filled with worms. It's hard. They don't really have effective ways to preserve food on long voyages back then. So pretty much by all accounts, it's really disgusting. Who else thought of something about food and why it's interesting? There are a couple hands up. Jennifer?
Well, food, like you said, is something very trivial, and so for a group of people to differ so much on something so small, and when it comes to the big things, I mean, they must just be completely, like, not like you at all.
Okay, yeah. So, so what Jennifer said is food is such a small thing, it's such an everyday thing that maybe it seemed kind of to presage the bigger cultural differences between the groups, right? Morgan?
I think also, especially at this time period, like you grew or you ate what you could grow where you were.
That's right.
So it's kind of a big symbol of the difference in like habitat, and so to bring on these foods, or that they had to they didn't know where they were going and they had to pack these foods is like another example of how the different places that they are, where they're coming from.
Okay. Yeah, so food at this point in time is very much a local product. I mean, people did ship foods internationally. It's actually interesting the ways in which there's already a global market for things like salted cod, like things that could really be preserved well. But in general, you ate local stuff. And so bringing food is kind of a way of bringing a little piece of home, right? And food is very tied up in our identities, even today, right? There are different regional variations in food across the United States, for example, right? I'm from the South, and we have a lot of strong ideas about our cuisine and what it says about us, right? And I'm sure you guys do too. And the differences are obviously even greater for these people that have much less access to foreign markets and to things like processed foods. Anything else about food? One thing that Adam mentioned was that the Montagnais people, they said that it looked like the French were drinking blood, right? Did anybody else catch that? Morgan?
Or it says that they're like men of iron who eat bones and drink blood.
Yeah.
So they're like monsters.
Right, they sound like monsters. So men of iron, so they have body armor on, who eat bone and drink blood. What does that sound like to you guys?
Well, I was wondering how much of that was Montagnais storytelling and how much of that was them trying to relay the story of Catholicism to the Montagnais.
Okay, so this is a really good point. What do you guys think about the construction of that Montagnais document? Because it's kind of a hybrid thing. It probably, it's certainly based on this oral tradition, but there's a mediator there, right? There's this Jesuit. How much do you think he's inserting? And how much of the actual document do you think he's capturing? So that was something that really struck Adam. Let's pull out our books. And let's see. 57? 67. Okay. Thanks, John. Okay, so if we look at the bottom of 67, now part of this is the Jesuit inserting his own thoughts about what happened. So In their words, this was the same astonishment upon meeting Europeans, first encounters. So this was the same astonishment that the king of Calcutta had felt before that when he saw the first European ships approach his shores. He sent messengers to find out who these people were whom the large wood house had brought. And the messengers reported back to their master that the people were amazing, frightful men who dressed in iron, ate bones, and drank blood. And then in parentheses, they had seen them wearing their cuirasses, which is armor, eating hardtack and drinking wine. So we also, what do you think? What is this an example of? I mean, what is this Jesuit drawing on for this? Why invoke this example of something that happened in India when he's talking about Canada? Rory.
Well, his audience isn't really North Americans. His audience is going to be other Europeans, and he's trying to relate a historical account of a native history to a European audience. So using something more familiar would, just paint a picture of what he's going for.
Okay, exactly. Yeah, that's a great answer. So essentially what's happening is we need to think about audience. And that's part of what I want you guys to think about as you go through primary sources. Who's the audience for this document? Who is this person writing to? Why are they writing it? And so as Rory said, he's not recording this for Montanai posterity, He's recording this for Europeans. And part of what Europeans are experiencing at this time is not just colonization in the Americas, but colonization around the world. Or just trading around the world, that they're meeting a lot of new people, a lot of foreign people. And so what human beings tend to do, which we've talked about a little bit, is when they encounter something new, they try to compare it to something they already know, or something that they think they know. So they draw not only on their knowledge, which is somewhat limited, of Indians in North America, but of foreign people around the world. What about, transitioning here, let's talk about food again, but in the context of Equiano's narrative. What does Equiano think about Europeans and their food? John?
Yeah, I know he talks about the first time they offered him wine.
Yeah.
He didn't take it, but then someone else, like a fellow slave, gave it to him. He said it was horrible.
Yeah. So one of the things that he remarks on too is this wine. And for many Africans and Indians, this is the first time they've ever had liquor, they've ever had alcohol. So, I mean, I think that if we look at other accounts, wine is something, and alcohol is something that people do remark on. People do tend to remark on when they're meeting Europeans. And does he say, he doesn't compare it, he doesn't compare it to blood, does he? But we do have some other primary accounts of Africans who are meeting Europeans in the context of the slave trade and see them drinking this really rich red fluid out of wine glasses, which are transparent, of course, and they think they see them drinking blood. So another thing that this brings up is cannibalism, right? Because essentially, isn't that what people are saying when they're talking about eating bones and drinking blood? Are there other instances of, now think about the whole semester, things that we've read early in the semester, even the films that we've watched, and the Columbus document, the Cabeza de Vaca document. Is cannibalism something that you saw in any of the other contexts? Can you remember? Maggie?
I can't remember who it was that was traveling down the Mississippi, but how the natives wouldn't take them farther because there were people that were man-eaters that lived farther down the river.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other documents that we read for 2 weeks ago was Marquette's account of traveling down the Mississippi. And one of the things that Marquette says was that the Menominee Indians refused to take him south, and they said, don't go south because the river is full of frightful monsters that will eat you. Can anybody else recall anything? Any fears of? Yeah.
I'm pretty sure in the Columbus document, he mentions hearing these rumors about this like island of cannibals from, I guess, the Native Indian men.
Absolutely. So he says, remember so Columbus is writing about Hispaniola in 1493. And he says, the people here are great, they're so nice, they're gonna be so easy to convert, they're giving, they're loving, but I've heard there are other islands with cannibals on them and monsters with eyes in the middle of their foreheads, and Amazons, too. What do you think all this talk is about? Why are people talking about monsters and cannibals? And why does that seem to be something that a lot of people are afraid of? Why do you think it's something that reoccurs? Mike, do you have an idea?
Well, I guess just the unknown, confronting the unknown can be scary, mysterious, so you imagine it, people are imaginative, so maybe their minds, go further than what they actually see. I don't know.
Okay.
I kind of think of like, the old maps where they would put the sea monsters where they didn't know they had to travel there, so like, they kind of just put like, the stereotypical monster there to represent what is unknown, what could be dangerous.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So it's really fear of the unknown, that there are certain limits to knowledge, and beyond that, people, Mike said that they kind of fill in the gaps with these fantastic images. And, I really wish that I had an image of one of those maps now that Mike mentioned, because on a lot of early American, or just early maps around the 16th century in particular, the context that these documents really come out of is that people would have sea monsters and Amazons and all kind of crazy stuff on maps, right? I do have a different image of a cannibal, right? So this is Fernandino Gorge's America Painted to the Life from 1659. So the cannibal image is quite clear, right? She's clearly holding up a human leg, which kind of looks like a ham hock or something, right? What else do you guys notice about this image?
Does she have blonde hair?
Yes, she appears to have blonde hair. She looks European. And we mentioned earlier that a lot of European artists had never been to the Americas, so they had no idea what Indians looked like. And especially early on in the colonial period, they just painted people to look like Europeans, because that's what they're used to painting. So Gorgeous, for example, had never been to the Americas.
Besides for her face, she's like basically the opposite of femininity. Like she's got huge muscles.
Yeah.
And she's wearing, obviously, she's not covering herself. And she's got a bow and arrow, and she's very, I guess, masculine.
Right. She is depicted here as an Amazon. And this is another example of how Europeans drew on knowledge about others and kind of tropes that reoccur in European history. So the first time that we see Amazons in European history is this Greek historian Herodotus wrote about the Amazons. You're shaking your head, so you know about this. And he wrote in the 5th century BC. He was a Greek, and he wrote about I mean, he's writing about history, but a lot of what he discussed was otherness and Greeks encountering other people. And our word barbarian comes from the Greek term barbaroi, which just means non-Greek, right? And a lot of when Herodotus talked about otherness, he was often, he himself was not terribly widely traveled. He just wrote on hearsay a lot, what he'd heard from other people. And when he discussed barbaroi, all non-Greeks, he often talked about how different they were from Greeks, and he wanted to accentuate that differentness. And other European writers, thought about the Greeks as their intellectual fathers, right? They look back to ancient Greece for defining civilization. What is civilized versus what's savage? And one of the things that Herodotus, that you can see in his writing that's perpetuated over time is an idea of inverted gender roles or weird gender roles. And this is something that Europeans remarked on when they met Indians, that Indians seem to have really strange and even inverted gender roles where women were warriors and had big muscles and had weapons, right? That they were ferocious. What else might we notice about this? Stephen?
Well, except for the arm, she doesn't really look scary or like a monster.
Yeah.
Except for the bow, too.
It is kind of a bizarre mix of something that's scary and hostile, but her expression itself is very calm, right? And why do you think that this is a woman? Why is America a woman in the first place? Why isn't America depicted as a man? And this is something, by the way, that we continue to do. It's a European intellectual tradition. We often talk about our homeland as she. Land is often feminized. Why is that? Why depicted as a woman? Do you have any guesses?
I mean, it's something to be conquered.
Okay, exactly. Right, so yeah, exactly. Don't be shy. This is, colonization is often seen as a sexual metaphor, right? Europeans thought about the Americas as a wild land to be tamed, and there are all kinds of sexual metaphors. You also have to consider the fact that the gender dynamics are really skewed in this early colonial period. So when most Indians and even most Africans met Europeans for the first time, they're almost all men. Because who are these guys? They're traders, they're soldiers, they're really not farmers in this early colonial period. So what we're encountering here is really different gender dynamics. And what makes her distinctively American? Why is she supposed to be? What are some of the stereotypes about Indians that you see even at this really early stage? Morgan?
Is that a feather headdress on?
Yeah, she's got a feathered headdress. Grace?
The nudity.
Yeah, the nudity, right? So, I mean, she has this bizarre combination of being both inviting and intimidating. She's savage and wild, but not unapproachable, right? Okay, so anything else about cannibalism? Let's talk about some of the other responses that you guys had to this question. So should we talk about ships and technology? Do you want to say anything else about people remarking on that? Maggie?
It seemed to be a recurring theme, especially Equiano said the same thing about the sails, how he didn't know. Like the technology of sails seems really primitive, like when I think about it.
Right.
The fact that they didn't know why they were there or what their function was. I think it's kind of ironic, but especially, remarking on the ship size and, how did it float since it was so big.
Yeah.
That type of stuff.
Okay. So part of this technology is really remarkable and it's novel and people are really intrigued by it. Anything else? I mean, do you think that Native people thought of Europeans as gods? Mike?
Yeah, I mean, you could say superhuman, maybe like not quite human, monster or god, whatnot.
Okay.
One example, a lot of, when, you know, he wasn't sure if they actually lived in this hollow place, as he called it, and so you just don't know, like, how these people live. It's just that they're kind of alien more than human.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So and it's an interesting that you noted that Europeans could be seen as gods or monsters, and there's a lot of room in between those two, right? But this is something that all people involved in this colonial encounter, they wonder if the other kind of people is fully human. Are these really human beings? Or are they monsters?
Also, with Equiano, he mentions when he first got aboard the ship, he thought he fell into a realm of like bad spirits that were trying to kill him.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there really is kind of a range of attitudes, right? That Europeans themselves were really proud of their technology. And they often talked in their own narratives that when I arrived at this island, the native people there thought that we were gods. But this is another kind of trope of colonialism. And it's true that non-Europeans thought of European technology as really interesting, thought that people were really different and maybe really powerful. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they were gods. I mean, maybe they thought they had some kind of spiritual power. But we run into the issue of translation here again. Remember we talked about John Eliot translating the Bible into the Massachusetts language? This is the first Bible printed in the New World, is printed in the Massachusetts language. But we talked about some of the difficulty of translating concepts and words, especially like the Trinity or like God, that's a really tricky thing to capture, especially when people don't have the same concept of those things.
I think another thing just about talking about the range of responses is when we were reading the thing about how the people reacted to the requerimiento.
Yeah.
And that they immediately acted like aggressively and they like attacked and were like, and so I feel like if you thought that this was like gods coming to talk to you, you'd maybe be a little more hesitant and like attacking them and trying to get them to like go. You might be more scared.
Right.
Just immediately aggressive.
Absolutely. So and this is a really great point that Morgan is making, that you can actually use if you decide to do a project that focuses on non-Europeans for your final paper. So regardless of what kind of project you do, most of the documents you read are going to be created by Europeans. But what you can do is look at native behavior. Look at the way that the source is describing what people do, because people's actions can reveal a lot. Even if Europeans don't necessarily understand what native people are saying, or even if they give some really weird explanation for what native people are doing, if you look at how people behave, it can reveal quite a bit. So attacking people would seem to suggest that, in fact, they did not believe these people were gods. What about Cabeza de Vaca's narrative? Now, I know we read that like 2 weeks ago, but we saw part of that movie too, the first day of class. And again, Cabeza de Vaca is this guy who shipwrecked on the Texas coast in 1528, and he took 8 years walking across the Southwest, across Texas and parts of New Mexico, and finally making it back to Mexico City in 1536. How does, one of the ways that he's able to survive is that he becomes a healer. And why do you think that native people asked Cabeza de Vaca to become a healer? And he says in his narrative that people compelled him to do it, that he really was afraid to try to heal these Indians who were experiencing this epidemic, but they kind of forced him to do it by revoking his food until he did so. Why pick Cabeza de Vaca and Estebanico and the other Spaniards to be healers? Mike?
Well, aside from like just being, you know, maybe godlike or monster-like or whatever, at that time when Cabeza de Vaca would have been around, I'm sure there would have been a lot of disease and death. So they know that something ominous is attached to these people, and maybe they think that they can cure that problem too. So
okay,
you know, maybe they're just looking for an answer to a problem they have.
Absolutely. So if we think about the entire context of colonial encounters, Native people at basically the same time that they meet Europeans are often experiencing really dramatic epidemic diseases. And Native people have a certain body of knowledge about disease and how to cure it. And Europeans have a certain body of knowledge about diseases and how to cure them. But what do you think happens when Native people encounter new diseases? You know, brand new diseases. They probably made some association that, hey, these diseases came on the scene right about the same time as Europeans did. So maybe they come from Europeans, and maybe Europeans have some special knowledge about how to cure those diseases that we don't have. Is there anything else about Cabeza de Vaca that might have been, that might have convinced Indians that he could be a healer? Jackie.
Wasn't there also like the people that were with him were also getting sick, but they found a way to make them better or something?
Yeah.
And that's kind of why they singled them out.
Okay. Yeah, so think about Cabeza de Vaca's whole story. He's part of this original expedition, the Narvaez expedition. And there's, I think out of the people who actually tried to walk back to Mexico, that there were about 400 people. Some of them shipwrecked, many of them starved or died because of disease. Remember that Europeans are also experiencing really stressed kind of conditions as a result of colonialism. And so out of those 400, 4 people make it back to Mexico City. 4 people are alive after about the first 2 years. So it would have been easy to imagine that maybe Cabeza de Vaca was special. Maybe even out of the Spaniards, that he was special and touched and somehow knew how to survive these things, that he was a remarkable person. And part of what this story reveals is that, that when Indians are encountering Europeans, they're curious not only about their technology or about their appearance, but also about the kind of knowledge that people might have, right? That they might have some kind of new knowledge because they come from a new place. And that might be useful to us, especially in the context of colonialism and things like disease. So there are useful things about Europeans, maybe. Okay, so going back to question 1, anything else you guys mentioned about what's remarkable? What are some of the things that you see reoccurring in these documents? What else did you write in your worksheets? Adam?
Well, Equiano describes the white men as having horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair.
Uh-huh.
And so he's also, and he also mentions this earlier in the passage. He talks a lot about their complexion.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much of that has to do with the fact that he's lived so long, he was a slave and escaped, or how much of that has to do with his childhood encounters with different groups of people where they might have focused on complexion.
Okay.
So, but I thought that was really interesting that he was very focused on race.
Okay.
From very early in the passage.
Okay. So it's pretty interesting because Equiano really is the only person who dwells on race at any length out of the three. And we might think in the context of today, where race is so important in America, that that might be the first thing that jumps out at people. But it's not necessarily true. Morgan?
I thought it was really interesting, especially reading this one, that he seems to describe them in a sort of way you would assume, like a stereotypical way that Europeans would describe like Native American people, like saying that they have like long loose hair,
Yeah.
and they have red faces, and that they're like savage.
Okay.
And so I thought that was really interesting.
Absolutely. So one of the really interesting things that Equiano does is to do this reverse gaze, where he, as a non-European, is calling Europeans savage and saying, you know, and all this talk about loose hair and red faces, these things are supposed to evoke savagery, right? What's the purpose of doing that? Why do that? And was that interesting to you guys? Was that surprising? And think about it, in some ways, Indians are doing this too, by saying these people, they might be monsters, they drink blood. You know, cannibalism is very much associated with savagery also, right? Why would Equiano do this, Morgan?
Well, just for his, especially because he became an abolitionist.
Yeah.
So he's using this example to like show how brutal they are with the African Americans and how wrong slavery is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he would characterize them that way.
Okay, yeah. So part of it is Equiano. I mean, we talked about, if we think about perspective and what's motivating people to write things, remember that Equiano, this is an autobiography, and the work that he expects this to do is to challenge slavery. So he's effectively trying to negate some of the rationale for slavery, right, which is that Africans are uncivilized. He's saying, no, you know, this is a really uncivilized kind of behavior, enslaving your fellow human beings, right? Somebody else had a hand up, Jennifer.
And he also like further compounds that by comparing like the European version of slavery to the slavery that he experienced back in Africa. He's talking about how he would much rather go back to being a slave in his homeland than continue to be aboard the ship, and he just can't believe like the cruelty that's acted. I mean, even on the white crewmen.
Right. Okay, so Equiano, part of what he's doing is that he had also been a slave in Africa. I mean, the reason, the way that nearly all Africans are captured in the slave trade is that they're enslaved for debt or in warfare, or sometimes, like Equiano, they're just kidnapped. But they do experience a kind of African slavery before they experience slavery in the context of Europeans. And that is also part of the rationale for slavery, right? These people are already enslaved. We're just taking people who are already enslaved. But Equiano is saying, no, that's a totally different kind of slavery. And you also brought up the example of talking about the white man who was whipped, right? So part of Equiano talks about how aboard the ship, the slave ship that's sailing to the Americas, that one of the white sailors on board is whipped mercilessly for some kind of minor offense. I don't remember if it's stealing, maybe. Why mention that? I mean, this is a book about Equiano's own autobiography, and he wants to talk about the abolition of slavery. Why bring up this issue of the white whipping? Grace?
Well, he thinks it's kind of remarkable that they would show that kind of cruelty even to their own people, and I think he's trying to get a point across that they don't really, they don't care about like who you are. They're gonna kind of be cruel to you either way. It kind of makes them seem even more barbaric.
Okay.
Than if he didn't use that example.
So Grace said it's kind of he's using this to highlight barbarism, right, and how that it's just kind of a complete disregard for human life in general. Did you want to add anything, Maggie?
That's what I was gonna say. Like, they did not. I mean, that's how they treated their like people they viewed lower as them. The fact that they treated people that were considered equal is just to like highlight how barbaric they were.
Exactly. So he's saying that even among Europeans, even among this group, that they are dehumanizing one another. And the larger point that he's trying to make here is that slavery is dehumanizing even to other white people. And if we think about audience again, most of Equiano's audience is who, do you think? Europeans, or or people of European descent, right? He's really not making an appeal to other, I mean, part of it is absolutely people of African descent are reading this, but most of the audience is of European descent. And so the appeal, part of what he's saying to them is that slavery is degrading to you too. Slavery degrades everyone who's involved in it, right? Okay, anything else about question 1 before we move on? Maggie?
I just wanted to note how different John Smith's narrative was than the other two. Being a European, like talking about what type of government that they had, he just seemed a lot more impartial, I guess, than the other two narratives did.
Okay.
He almost seemed to write in a very European way, referring to like the chief or the head of that nation as a king, or try to put it in a European monarchy type context.
Absolutely. So part of what Maggie said is that John Smith seems more impartial than the others, and also gives this really full explanation of Powhatan political structure. Why do you think he might be more impartial than the other two, just given what I've told you about his bio? He's a tool? He thinks he knows everything. But he considers himself very worldly, right? He has traveled a lot more than most Europeans have. And he's seen a lot more of the world. So I think he does probably think of himself as a kind of ethnographer, right? And what about, why record all this stuff about Powhatan political structure?
I found it really interesting that it seems that he's almost trying to make them seem strong, but also weak. So he's describing Powhatan as this emperor over all these little kingdoms and all these kings and everything. But then towards the end of that, he mentions that it will be very easy to sort of kick them all into line after he deals with Powhatan.
Right.
It's making them seem powerful so he can be more of an adventurer, but then also making them seem weak and savage and barbaric. That way they're easy to convert.
Okay.
Everyone can know that it's not a difficult job in terms of, for him, it's not difficult to convert all these people and whip them into line.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And then he's giving this explanation of what's going on, right, of the structure itself. And one thing that we can think about history is that history is always a process of translation. That these early encounters, all the documents that we read, they're kind of trying to translate the experience of meeting someone really, really different from themselves. But we as historians now are also translating historical experiences that are very different from ours. So part of this is that what Smith is trying to do, and this is something that Maggie brought up too, is that he's trying to bring about similar concepts, right? That they have this chief named Powhatan, but he's like a king. And there are these lords who are below Powhatan in the political structure. But it's no accident that he chooses that word, because that's the same word that they use in England, right? To talk about nobles who owe allegiance to the king. So he's trying to make these things intelligible to himself and to his audience, but at the same time expose weaknesses, right? Who else? Do you have a hand up, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that it was interesting to me that John Smith was more concerned with the political structure, because that's he wasn't afraid of the people, whereas the other two documents there was a sense of fear. He was impressed by the power that Powhatan.
Yeah. So part of it is, and he really does give a very full explanation, and historians use that today actually to think about Powhatan life and Powhatan culture. And part of it is that, he wants to make it intelligible to his audience, but he's obviously using this for the purposes of eventually understanding how to colonize Virginia, right? I lost my train of thought a little bit there. Sorry, Sarah. Anything else? Well, why remark? One thing that you said is that it's particularly impressive, that it was impressive to him. Why would it be impressive? Why would it, why go on about this at such length? Grace?
I feel like he emphasizes a lot of like the Native Americans' otherness. Like he sees himself as a very different person from them, and I think that he would view his own political system as something that's like high up. So when he sees these other people who are just so different from him, like kind of they have a similar political system, he's going to think, oh, this is amazing. Like he probably didn't expect them to, because he calls them barbarians more than once in the document.
Yeah.
So he probably doesn't expect these so-called barbarians to have such a quote-unquote civilized form of government.
Absolutely. I mean, he's comparing it to kind of the highest form of civility, which is, of course, Englishness in his own mind, right? So I'm going to put political structure too. And again, Grace said that he mentioned the word barbarian at several points. And this is directly invoking this Greek concept of barbaroi and otherness. And so he's drawing on what he thinks he knows about barbarous people, which is that they're simple, that they're primitive, that they don't have organized forms of government. And these are some of the same stereotypes that are still present in American culture about Indians, right? They are. And so part of his surprise and part of why he records this is that it differs so much from his expectations. Now, these people do have political hierarchy, and they even have something that looks a lot like class, in that people give deference to the lords and to Powhatan. So he's surprised at the similarities. Anything else? We should probably move on. Anything pressing? Okay. So we've talked a little bit about the names that people call one another. We've mentioned barbarians, savages, and there's a lot of accusations of cannibalism. What else? What other names do people call each other? Adam, you mentioned one in the Montanai document.
Yeah, they call the French those who work with wood.
Those who work with wood. So the Montanai are calling the French those who work with wood. Anybody else want to mention one that they wrote down? Grace?
I think we might have mentioned this, but Equiano calls his captures bad spirits.
Bad spirits.
At first, he's not really sure, who they are, and that's the only way he could probably think of to describe them.
Okay. So they seem, and again, there's this anxiety about, are these people human? Are they not? They seem to be kind of monstrous. Rory?
Well, I thought it was interesting that John Smith had, he specifically talked about the name Powhatan. Powhatan has a different name.
Yep.
He prefers to equate Powhatan with his extensive territory than his given name.
Right, right. Powhatan is not his given name. So, he also talks about titles. And he, more than other people, and this is a really interesting observation that you guys have made, is that he gives a lot more explanation, and he seems a lot more knowledgeable, right? So he's just not giving a generic name that these are all Indians or these are all savages, but John Smith's the only one who calls people by their names and gives names in his documents.
On that same point, I thought that was a really interesting point, because it's like Chief Powhatan, as in like chief of the Powhatan place or the Powhatan people, and then that's like the name that we still think of, or like that they used in the Disney movie, and so like that'd be like saying like Mayor of Bloomington, and then like the rest of history calling him Bloomington, even though like, he has a real name that isn't anything to do with that.
Absolutely. So sometimes, and this is a really good point to make, is that many of the names that come down to us from history, especially when it comes to non-Europeans, are distortions or abstractions or just plain old mistakes. So if we look at, there are lots of good examples of this, but one good example is the word Cherokee. And you guys probably all heard of the Cherokees, right? And this word actually comes from a word from their enemies, a neighboring tribe called the Creeks, and they called the Cherokees Chilokee. And that means people of a different speech. because probably what happened is that Europeans went to this area and said, who are those people living to the north of you guys? And they said, oh, those are the Chaloki, you know? And the name sticks. And a lot of it has to do with literacy and print and the ways in which these things are reproduced. That eventually the rest of the world comes to know you as Cherokee, when Cherokees themselves call themselves Aniyunwia, which means the real people, and is obviously a really different and much more laudatory meaning than people of a different speech. Okay, what about other names that people call each other? Anybody else want to mention anything? What do these names reveal? I mean, names are really interesting because what do they capture? One thing that we could mention from Rory is that they capture John Smith's interest in political structure, right? In rank and things like social rank. What else do they capture? What about, from your example, Adam, what does that capture, you think? The people who work with wood.
What the Montagnais thought was important about the French.
Okay, which was what?
Their ships.
So it reflects what the Montagnais thought was interesting about the French, which is their ships, their technology.
I thought it showed a difference between how much time or how much time the different people had spent together. So John Smith, he knew a little bit more about Powhatans because he had been with them, you know, for a couple years. Whereas, you know, the Montagnais, it was a very brief encounter. So they identified them by physical things or things that they stereotyped them with. So, you know, Equiano was the same way. He called them, you know, white men. He even called the people he was with black men because they were from different African nations.
Right.
So because there's so little communication, they identified each other by physical traits or stereotypes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great generalization for all of us, is that when we think about documents, think about how much knowledge the person who's creating the document has about this culture or this history or this people. And it varies a lot from really, really brief encounters that tend to be ill-informed and maybe mostly informed by stereotypes or bad generalizations to people who are much more intimate and involved with different colonial projects, with different people. So knowledge bases really differ a lot, right? And especially Equiano is really interesting because he's the only one out of the three documents that really uses race as a concept to categorize other people. And Adam mentioned that part of this is because he's writing much later than the other two and for a very different audience. So skin color in particular is not something that necessarily immediately jumps out at people. It's something that takes time to develop ideas about. So the ideas that Equiano is talking about really only emerge in the 18th century, so in the 1700s. After colonization has happened for a long period of time, and particularly in the context of slavery, where race becomes really, really important because it becomes a justification for slavery en masse of millions of people. Anything else about names? So before we talk about question 3, I want to go on to some quotations from primary sources that we didn't read, and also some images to give us another look at first encounters. Okay, so just jump in at any point. So these are from some different kinds of contexts, and this one is from a French writer who traveled throughout much of the southeast and lower Mississippi Valley. And he's writing in 1751 about Indians. Usually both male and female Indians have no hair on their bodies except on their heads. In that respect, they say we resemble animals. They think this too when they see us eat herbs and salads. So again, we have this image that's conjured up of Europeans as the savages or as uncivilized. And the things that Native people are remarking on, part of it is based on appearance, physical appearance, right? In that Europeans seem to be really hairy, which is closer to the animals than to be less hairy, probably, right? And also behavior, so not just appearance, but also behavior, in that they eat raw vegetables. And in most native cultures, particularly in the area that Basso is talking about, people don't usually eat raw vegetables. Usually they're stewed or cooked in some way. And who eats raw things? Also animals, right? So there are certain things that you can see that are patterns. You know, this goes back to food again. And people definitely do remark on appearance. But again, skin color may not be the primary thing that they remark on. It may be some other kind of aspect of appearance. So this one is actually from a Creek chief who has a Scottish father, hence his name, Alexander MacGillivray, in the late 1700s. And this is part of an oral tradition that his people, the Creeks, had, that his ancestors found the De Soto expedition remarkable because the Spaniards had, quote, hair all over their bodies. So again, it's another reference to hair. And the profuse amount that Europeans had. So a Natchez Indian in the early 1700s, he has a French acquaintance who's actually a neighbor of his. And this is in the region that's now the lower Mississippi Valley, Louisiana. And the comment that he makes to his French friend is, our people say that when many Frenchmen are together, they speak all at once, like a flock of geese. And this is an example of etiquette, right? That the Natchez, for example, would never speak all at once. Interrupting somebody is really, really rude, especially in a public kind of context. And so what he thinks is most interesting about the French is that they are so rude. They just interrupt each other all the time. And if we get to the issue of names again and what people call each other, we'll see some resonance here with the Montani oral tradition. So there are two Mohawk terms that we have, and these come down to us from writings from the 1600s that Mohawks called the Dutch Christoni, which means I am a metal maker. And their term for Europeans more generally is Aceroni, which means axe maker. So this comes back to the issue of an interest in technology, and specifically in this context, they're not so much interested in ships, but what do you think? Why do you think they're mentioning these things in particular, axes and metal? Why call Europeans that? Armor. Could be armor, weaponry, and they want to trade these things. One of the things that frequently interests Native people the most about European is their material goods, and especially things that they might trade. Native people already have axes that are made out of stone that's chipped and then attached to wooden shafts. But they see these axes that are made of steel, and they say, I want one of those. I know what that is. That's very similar to something I have, but even better. So it also reveals, these names can reveal what people think is interesting about the other. And it's not always white, black, Indian. It might be this person is an axe maker, or this person is a Christian, or this person is savage. You know, it can be a whole range of things. And then if we get back to the question of Europeans as gods or as supernatural beings or monsters or whatever they are, there's a Choctaw term, Nahalo, which became kind of a generalized term for people of European descent. And this early trader is recalling his youth in the Choctaw Nation in the mid-1700s, and he said, they said white man was a Nahalo, or very beloved. However, a dictionary that came out a few decades later defined Nahalo as one that creates fear and reverence. an inhabitant of the invisible world. And obviously, so there's quite a bit of distinction between those two, right? And you can see that there is this kind of anxiety about what exactly Europeans are, what their intentions are, what their strengths might be. Maggie.
Is the difference in spelling just normal early American difference in spelling, or does that affect the translation?
Nah, it's just this early American. And especially we'll see this. We've talked about spelling quite a bit in this class so far and how it wasn't standardized in early America. And effectively what people are doing, especially when they hear Indian terms, is they're just trying to spell what they hear. So there's a lot of difference. And it's something you guys will be dealing with when you do your papers too. So now we're going to kind of move from Indian perspectives to European perspectives, and especially through images. And by the way, there's a great archive of these images that you may want to check out. And I'll put this PowerPoint online, but it's from the Digital Library of the University of North Carolina, digitized a few dozen of these images. And these in particular come from the Roanoke settlement. Okay, so the first English attempt to colonize what they called Virginia, but Roanoke is what's in North Carolina now. It's around Cape Hatteras. So what we have here are a couple different watercolors that, actually I should say that they're based on watercolors, but then they became engravings for books in Europe. So they're also, the ones that we'll see today are hand colored. So these things are engraved, and then an artist in Europe colors things in, okay? So let's make just some observations about what we see in these images and what they reveal about how Europeans experienced Indians. And again, this is another example of a first encounter it's actually even earlier than Jamestown, right? It's 1607 versus 1585, so about a generation earlier. What do you notice? I don't know how well you can see it. What about, can you see the colors that this artist decided to use for these people? Can you tell what they are? Do these guys look dark or light? This guy actually has red hair, and this guy's a blonde. So this is completely based on the artist's own imagination in terms of what their complexions were like. Rory?
They look to be lined up in the back there practicing their archery in nice formation.
Yes, yes, exactly. So these guys are both archers. And in the back we have warriors who are kind of exercising. So and you're right, this is a scene of kind of order, right, and symmetry. But also warriors, which is another kind of something that Europeans were very interested in, something that they noticed about Indian men. I actually have a funny story about this image. I went to look at the original of this in the Rare Books collection when I was a graduate student, and I needed a scan of it for my dissertation. And the guy who did the scan was like, man, I need to get on the Theodore Debris AB program, right? Because, I mean, look at these guys are ripped, right? I need to get on the Theodore Debris AB program. So they're also incredibly physically intimidating. And these are definitely idealized bodies, which was a kind of convention of art in Europe at the time. So they're especially idealized bodies, but overall, this is something that Europeans remark on about Indians, that overall Indian men in particular are much taller than Europeans because their diets are better at the time. Physically, they are often bigger. It's a pretty good generalization that most men in native societies, at least part-time, acted as warriors, and their lives were very physical. So, you know, they probably were in really good shape. Anything else you want to mention about this? right, we'll move on to the next one here. So this is the same series of images that are coming out of Roanoke. And we have another blonde and another redhead here. This time women, of course. But what is the tone of this image? I think, what do you notice about it? Maggie?
It's very feminized.
Mm-hmm.
The way that they're standing, their posture in general.
Right.
It's not like the two men before, which are meant to be intimidating and a little bit frightening. It's more
right. They're definitely. I mean, they're still physically they look very healthy and. But they're definitely much more feminized, right? They're kind of dainty, posing one foot in front of the other. Anything else you want to mention? What about their kids? It's kind of a playful image. Would you say that? And part of what Europeans are trying to communicate by depicting Indian bodies this way is that the land is healthy. It's such a rich land that everybody eats well and is healthy. And so part of what they're actually doing by idealizing these bodies is saying, this is a great place. We should all come live here. We could all be on the Theodore Debris ab program and get abs of steel. But this is definitely not a hostile image, right? And even the warriors themselves, they kind of seem to be displaying themselves more than being actively aggressive. Oh, this is an interesting one too. And this comes from slightly different context. This is done in Florida in 1564. And so what are they depicting here? Obviously, it's called Alligator Hunt. But what do you notice about it?
The alligators are like 5 times the size of the human.
Yeah, they're enormous. And what do they look like? Like if you had to compare the alligator to something, what would you say it looked like? A dragon. It totally looks like a dragon. So alligators are something that's new, that Europeans are encountering for the first time. And in addition to new people, new land, they're also encountering a whole new range of animals. And the alligator was extremely impressive. And presumably what the artist, the only reference that he had in his own mind was dragons, right? So this is also is clearly drawing on some reality, but there's a lot of imagination that goes into this image too. And I really can't imagine that Native people would have killed an alligator by shoving a giant log into its mouth. It doesn't seem like the easiest way, really. Okay, so we're going to look at so 2 images now that these were actually included in the same book that the 3 previous images were. So this was one giant book that was about colonialism in North America, the new colonies. And as part of this, the author decided to include a couple of pictures of Picts. Does anybody know who the Picts are? They are an ancient people who were an ethnic group in what's now Great Britain. So when the Romans arrived, this is one of the ethnic groups that populated what's now England. And so we have 2 images here, this guy and also a woman included in the book. And along with these images is this caption, which I'll read to you guys, which is in the crazy 16th century English that I know you enjoy reading so much. In times past, the Picts, inhabitants of one part of Great Britain, which is now named England, were savages, and did paint all their body after the manner following. They did let their hair grow as far as their shoulders, saving those which hang upon their forehead, upon which they did cut. They shave all their beard except the mustaches. Upon their breast wear painted the head of some bird. Upon the belly some fearful monster's face. Spreading the beams very fair upon the thighs. Upon the knees some two faces of lion, and upon the legs as yet hath been shelves of fish. Upon their shoulders griffins' heads, and then they hath serpents about their arms. And when they hath overcome some of their enemies, they never fail to carry away their heads with them. So what is the purpose of including those images of the pigs and then this quote in that same book about the Americas? Why would you do that? These are Europeans who are going to be reading this. Grace?
I'm trying to give them something to relate Native Americans to, like a basis for comparison. The artist must have seen some similarities between the Native Americans and between depictions of the pigs.
Okay. So it's part of it is about what we've been talking about, which is a basis of comparison, right? And so they're drawing upon ancient times in Europe for this comparison. And they obviously see some similarities, that the people are largely naked, that they have tattoos, that they're very warlike. And why do that? I mean, what's the message of that? Do you think it would have been insulting for Europeans, or do you think it might have served some kind of purpose? I mean, if you're trying to sell books, what are you trying to say about the New World? Jennifer?
Maybe they're trying to say that there were these savage people in Britain before, but we conquered them. And now there are these savages in America, but we can conquer them.
Okay, yeah. So it's really about creating a comparison between ancient peoples of Europe and contemporary to them peoples of the Americas. That, yes, their culture is very different and it's very, quote, savage. But not only can we conquer them, but once we were the savages, right? We were these people. And so, too, can they become like us. So it's a really interesting kind of optimism. And part of the reason I wanted to show you guys these images is that I think we can make a generalization about early encounters, and that some things tend to be, people point out all kinds of differences, and they are really afraid of one another, that some things can seem totally incomprehensible, like they're requirimiento. But other things can seem kind of familiar, that you both eat food, you both are interested in technology, that there are certain kinds of comparisons, and it's a way of making the other into something that you can understand. And there's a lot of optimism on both sides. If we look at this example of the debris book about early Virginia, and also if we look at what Powhatan is trying to do with the Jamestown colony, that he's trying to incorporate it as part of his chiefdom. So there's a lot of optimism on both sides, that not only can we understand these people, but we can make them like us. So there's a lot of optimism that things could have turned out differently, that maybe people could have created a whole different kind of society together, especially early on. So we're running out of time here, but and I do want to just mention this picture of Pocahontas, which began our slideshow, does kind of sum up this point nicely. So this is a painting that was made after an engraving in 1616 when she visited the English court. So Pocahontas marries John Rolfe in Virginia in, I think, 1614, and then they travel together to England with their young son in 1616. She dies shortly thereafter, unfortunately, but before she dies, this painting is made of her. And what do you guys, raise your hand if you've seen this before. Okay, so not very many people. What do you notice about it? What's interesting about this painting? Grace?
I actually had a question. Because a lot of the paintings we looked at, they didn't use like models. They didn't look at real people to paint them. Did she model for this, or was this just made up?
She actually sat for this. Yeah. So one of the differences that Grace is right. This is actually, it is a copy, but it's painted from life, and it's supposed to depict an individual versus, just kind of a broad range of people. What does she look like to you guys? She looks like a European, yeah. She's very fair, for one thing. So that's another thing we've been talking about, is making Indians intelligible to Britons and other Europeans, that they're often painted to look European. What about what she's wearing? What kind of outfit is that?
It looks like something nobility would wear.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. She looks like an Elizabethan lady. And that's how she was treated in England, was as a princess. Sarah, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say that she looked like she was upper class.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, she's depicted as very Europeanized, but again, what this reflects is Pocahontas. The reason why she's such an enduring symbol is that she is a symbol of what could optimistically happen in Virginia, that Native people could become like Europeans, could marry Europeans, could have children with them, could cohabitate in this new land with them. Yeah, Morgan.
Did when she came to Jamestown and married John Rolfe, was it she sort of became this person that we see in the picture? Like she did sort of adapt completely to the ways of life in Jamestown and leave the Powhatan way of life? Does that make sense?
Oh no, I know exactly what you're saying. So Morgan's question is, did she effectively become English, or was she still Powhatan, or some mix in between? So I mean, Pocahontas' real life story is nothing like the love story that you see in the Disney movie. She doesn't fall in love with John Smith when she's a child. She is only a child. She's probably 9 when they meet. But what happens to her when she's, I think, 12 or 13, she's captured by the Jamestown colonists and held as a captive for years against her will. Because what the colonists are trying to do is extort food from Powhatan, from her father. And so while she's held in captivity, she does learn to speak English. I think she's educated in the Bible somewhat, so I think she knows enough to be able to read the Bible. But we don't have anything from Pocahontas' own hand to capture what she felt or what she experienced. She did marry John Rolfe when she was 16, so she does marry an English guy. They do have a kid together. And I would say it's very likely that she did live this kind of hybrid life, right, where she had grown up as a Powhatan, but later experienced life much like an elite colonist, at least, would have. Does that answer your question? But I mean, there's a real, one of the frustrating things about Pocahontas is she's such a compelling figure, but there's very little to reveal her own feelings, and we have to put a lot of guesswork into that. Okay, so just to wrap up for today, one of the larger questions in the class that we're tackling, and especially when we think about perspective, I asked you guys in your worksheets, is history an objective or a subjective study of the past, or both? And what role should this perspective play? What did you guys come up with when you were thinking about these documents? What larger lessons can we draw for our research papers? Grace?
Well, I think it's subjective in more than one way, because history is it's written down by people as they witness it or as they hear about it. But we as individuals who come to read these documents, we have to interpret it for ourselves too. So there's kind of two different forces of subjectivity going on. So you have to be kind of conscious of that when you're reading these things, and be conscious of other people's biases and your own biases.
Okay, that's great. I mean, so what Grace said, just to recap, is that there's kind of a double subjectivity, and that people who are experiencing these events and writing them down, they're experiencing things through their own lenses and their own basis of knowledge and their previous experiences. And then we as historians, when we in turn reinterpret these things, we can't help but see the world through the eyes that we have, right? Anybody else? Tara?
I said that like history should like theoretically be objective, but because primary sources are like the best sources for history, there's like an innate subjectivity that like we try and find objectivity by balancing out like different sides of the subjective sources to find like the truth or the real story.
Okay. And I think that that's often the way, especially when we learn history in primary and secondary school, that it's kind of like the facts, right? Or this is the story or the truth of what happened. And there is a way in which historians do strive to distance themselves from their sources and try to understand where sources are coming from. And as Sarah said, also balance out perspective, especially if we're writing, as we are in this class, about colonial encounters and about something as charged and as problematic as the sources that come out of this period, that we do strive for a balance. But the reality is we're still dealing with flawed, biased human beings who created these documents. That's just what we have. And we ourselves have to understand our own biases. Absolutely. Anybody else? Okay, I think what we're just, we're going to wrap it up here. So that's it for today.